This is part 3 of the chapter 2 lecture notes. We just were talking about ions, and I showed you the 2 cations and 1 anion. So now let me show you how the ionic bonds form. So ionic bonds form between cations and anions. In other words, ions with opposite charges. Probably the most common example that's used in science classes to illustrate the ionic bond is salt or sodium chloride. So what's happening is that the extra electron that sodium has a valence shell electron. We're not worried about all the other electrons. We're just looking at the electron in its outermost shell. Sodium has, I think, 11 electrons. So they're only showing you the valence electrons so you can understand it's only the valence electrons that react, that cause chemical bonds to form. So sodium has 1 electron in its valence shell, and it's easier to lose that 1 electron and then let the energy level below or closer to the sodium atom that's already full, let that be the one that's full. So sodium will lose that electron, and since chloride or chlorine needs to gain one, it's perfect. They have a perfect relationship. Sodium gives an electron to chlorine and makes it a chloride ion. And now these ions are oppositely attracted, so they become a compound. Opposites attract, Okay, now there is another way that chemical bonds can form, and honestly, in biology, most of our chemicals that we learn about in biology are formed by covalent bonds. So it's important that you understand the 2 types of bonding, but covalent bonds are more common in biology, okay? So covalent bonds are stronger than ionic bonds, and they are stronger for a reason. They're stronger because the 2 atoms one doesn't transfer an electron to the other. They share electrons. They share valence electrons. So if you look at these 2 oxygen atoms on the left, each one of them has 6 valence electrons. Each one has 6 valence electrons. So how many electrons does each of those oxygen atoms need? They each need 2 in order to have 8 in their valence shell, in order to fulfill the octet rule and become stable. So what they do is they share a pair of electrons. These 2 electrons came from the oxygen on the left, and these 2 electrons came from the oxygen on the right. They share them. What they do is they move close enough to each other that those electrons are shared with within their valence energy level, within their outer energy level. So now, if you count up how many electrons that the oxygen on the left has, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then if you do that for the other one, it's the same thing. They each now have 8 electrons in their outer energy level or their valence shell. So covalent bonds are stronger, and they form by the sharing of electrons. Okay? And by the way, whenever it's a pair of electrons, so each one of these lines represents a covalent bond between those 2 atoms. But if you do one line, that means 2 electrons are shared. 2 lines is a double bond, and it means 4 electrons are shared. Or you could say a pair of electrons are shared. I'm sorry. 2 pairs of electrons are shared. All right, so covalent bonds can be classified further into polar or nonpolar covalent bonds. Now, the oxygen molecule, this is actually a molecule whose formula is O2. It's 2 atoms of oxygen chemically combined by a double covalent bond. This would be called a nonpolar covalent bond, nonpolar. And it's nonpolar because the electrons in between the 2 atoms are equally shared. So nonpolar, the electrons are equally shared between the atoms that form the molecule. But some covalent bonds are a little bit like ionic because they are what we call polar. Now, if an electron, if a compound, if a molecule is polar covalent, then the electrons are unequally shared. In other words, one of the atoms has a stronger pull or a stronger hold on those electrons than the other one. And so we call that one slightly negative and represent it with a delta minus, this little thing and a minus. And then we call the other one slightly positive. So a few examples of polar and nonpolar. Here is a polar covalent bond that you see in water. In water, which is H2O, since they don't have that anywhere, I'll write it. That's the chemical formula for water. You probably knew that. But the hydrogen atoms don't have as strong of a pull on the electrons that are being shared. What happens is each hydrogen atom shares an electron with the oxygen. And so since there are two hydrogen atoms, the oxygen gains two by doing this. And as you know from the previous example, oxygen needs two electrons to be stable. So hydrogen only needs one. So one oxygen with two hydrogen satisfies all three of those atoms, octet rules. But the oxygen has a slightly negative charge compared to the hydrogen end of the molecule, which has a slightly positive charge. So that makes water a polar covalent molecule. Now, nonpolar a lot of times just means that, like, actually carbon is slightly negative compared to hydrogen, but because the hydrogens are all the same charge or the same slight charge, they have the same electronegativity, is how you would word it. This molecule is called methane, and it's carbon bonded to four hydrogens, and the electrons are equally shared here because the hydrogens are evenly distributed around that carbon. So you don't have, the thing you're looking for is one end of the molecule being slightly positive and another end being slightly negative. Well, you don't have that in methane, in CH4. But you do have a nonpolar molecule here, which is CO2. And the reason it's nonpolar is even though carbon is slightly positive and oxygen is slightly negative compared to carbon, the two oxygens are on the end of the molecule. They're not bent like in water. So you have two negative ends. That's not a polar molecule. That's a nonpolar molecule. So you've got two examples here of nonpolar molecules, methane and carbon dioxide. Oxygen was another example that's nonpolar. And then you've got one example of a polar molecule, water. Now, one thing that you need to know is that as far as things that will dissolve in certain solvents, substances which will dissolve in a solvent, a polar covalent molecule can dissolve ions, ionic compounds, and other polar compounds or other polar molecules. So what can dissolve in water? Well, ions can dissolve in water, anything with a charge, or ionic compounds like sodium chloride, which splits up into sodium with a positive charge and chloride with a negative charge when it dissolves in water. So ionic compounds, and then other polar molecules can dissolve in water because water is also polar. But with nonpolar molecules can only dissolve nonpolar molecules. An example of nonpolar is oils, which are lipids or fats. Okay, so we do need to talk about another type of bond called a hydrogen bond. We know that water contains 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, and we know that the hydrogen atoms have a slightly positive charge and the oxygen has a slightly negative charge. So if you've got 2 water molecules, like if you've got, here's one. Another water molecule is going to line up with this one with the hydrogen facing its oxygen end. And those dots represent the hydrogen bond. So what that's saying is that water molecules are attracted to each other. This is not, a hydrogen bond doesn't form a chemical, it doesn't form a compound or a molecule. It is a bond between different molecules that kind of holds them together. Think about how what water does whenever it rains on your windshield. It kind of forms beads or droplets. That's because those water molecules are attracted to each other. Or when you spill water on the floor or a liquid on the floor, it forms puddles. It doesn't just spread evenly out on the floor. That's because the water molecules are attracted to each other by hydrogen bonds. Okay, DNA is another example where hydrogen bonding is used. So this is a little bit more complicated than I plan to explain, but let's see here. Let's see how to explain this. All right, so what you're looking at is a nucleotide called thymine here. And DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid, but it is composed of nucleotides. Nucleotides are kind of like the building blocks of DNA. So in the DNA chain, the thymine is bonded to an adenine nucleotide. So thymine and adenine are nucleotides, and they are bonded to each other by hydrogen bonding. The hydrogen in the thymine forms a hydrogen bond with the nitrogen in the adenine because the nitrogen is slightly negative and the hydrogen is slightly positive. And then there's also a hydrogen bond between the oxygen in the thymine, which is slightly negative, and the hydrogen in the adenine, which is slightly positive. So you don't have to get, you don't have to really understand this super well, but just know that hydrogen bonds are what hold DNA together. Okay, they're bonds that hold DNA together. Okay, so we're going to talk about carbon now. Carbon is special in in living things, in organisms, because carbon is an atom that's able to form 4 chemical bonds. It has 4 electrons in its outermost shell, and it can form 4 chemical bonds, which is the largest number of bonds that any atom can form. So carbon has 4 electrons in its outer shell. So this is carbon. And I'm just going to draw the valence shell. It's got 1, 2, 3, 4 electrons. So carbon typically forms covalent bonds. So it would need to share 4 electrons with either one atom or more than one atom. But it would need to gain a total of 4 electrons by sharing. Okay? So there are groups of chemicals that we call functional groups. And these functional groups are, you'll need to recognize them. They will, you can see these chemical groups and they will kind of define the characteristics of that molecule. Now, one thing that happens a lot of times in organic molecules is they will have rings or chains of hydrocarbons. Carbon can actually form 4 bonds with hydrogen. We just saw that with methane. But sometimes what happens is instead of carbon being bonded to hydrogen here, it's bonded to another carbon and another carbon and another carbon and another carbon. And then all those other carbons are bonded to hydrogen where they're not attached to another carbon. So one functional group is called a hydroxyl group. R just represents that this can be any atom or any molecule. That means it's a molecule attached to an OH, an oxygen and a hydrogen. It is a polar functional group. It's hydrophilic, meaning it's water loving. It's soluble in water.